An anonymous professor was once quoted as saying, "If you need statistics to prove it, it isn't true."
Welcome to the A&P Professor, a few minutes to focus on teaching human anatomy and physiology with a veteran educator and teaching mentor, your host, Kevin Patton.
In this episode, I talk about mastering concepts, why we want to be the hippocampus, turning my gray hair brown, and stats regarding my wacky testing scheme. I do not want my students to master the concepts of A&P. As a matter of fact, I don't even want to think about the mastery of concepts in A&P. You're probably thinking, what? It doesn't make any sense. Well, I think it will make sense in a minute. And it's, of course, intentionally kind of misleading, but it's got you listening right now, right? Okay, so this goes back to a topic I brought up in the previous episode, that is episode 101, when I was talking about using the word normal when we teach A&P. And I had mentioned that I was going through my latest revision project in a textbook, and our whole team was really looking closely at certain terms that are often overused and can be problematic when teaching A&P, or when teaching anything really. And one of those words is normal. And I said that I found out I was using the word normal way too much. And that's not good writing, right? And so that was a good reason I did that. And so we looked at every example of the use of the word normal in our book, and we looked at whether that was really the most appropriate term. And very seldom was that really the most appropriate term. Most often, we didn't need the word at all. It was an unnecessary adjective. But sometimes there were other synonyms that we used instead of normal, like typical, for example, or, well, there's a whole list of different words that we found work better, and therefore they're more clear to the student. But the other benefit of this, and this is really what prompted us to do this, is because of that potentially problematic part of it. Because there are a lot of us, including our students, but even we faculty, who are not exactly in the middle of the various conditions, circumstances, structures, and functions that we consider to be typical or usual human structure and function. We're maybe somewhere closer to the edge of that spectrum or range of being human. Maybe we're really far to one end of that spectrum of being fully human and not pathological and not damaged and not defective. And yet, when we talk about the context in episode 101 was body temperature, and there's a wide range. And what we often think of as the normal, that is the mean in humans, has changed over time. And we're not using what the current mean is as our common example. So calling it normal isn't really a great idea. But when we're talking about other aspects of being human, it can get even more problematic. Because maybe being at, toward one end or the other of the spectrum of humanity, of human experience, of human identity, then maybe we have certain vulnerabilities. Maybe when we hear that term normal, it triggers a feeling, it triggers thoughts, it triggers concepts that we're not intending to portray in our course, and that is distracting to learning and leads students down different trails than we're trying to lead them. And in a way, it does harm because we're calling attention to something that maybe has harmed them in some way outside of our class. So it in itself becomes a reminder of harm and therefore harmful itself. In a lot of ways, not every way, but in a lot of ways, I tend to be sort of near the middle of that spectrum of humanity, or at least near the middle of what the dominant culture considers to be the middle or the norm or whatever for, human experience and human identity and so on. But, I'm an old, white, cis, straight male. And so, yeah, that's a dominant experience in our culture. And things are written from that perspective. And more, I've been becoming aware of that dominance. And I don't want to be dominant as far as being a teacher or being an educator, being a textbook author. I want to encourage everyone. I want to be helpful to everyone, no matter where they are on the spectrum. So what does that have to do with mastering concepts? Well, one of those problematic terms is the term master and its derivatives like mastery. We also looked for terms like master gland, which is an obsolete way of referring to the pituitary gland. And as it turns out, it was there, but with an explanation that it really isn't a very helpful term. So we just took that out entirely. And we found references to DNA as the master code, which we also changed. In our culture, here in the United States certainly, but around the world as well, there's this colonial kind of slavery and therefore mastery that has occurred that has caused untold harm and is still continuing to cause untold harm. And I don't want to be part of that. And that word master and its derivative mastery never bothered me. I have used them a lot and I still do sometimes, but I do it unintentionally. I'm trying to train myself. I'm trying to change the habit of using those terms unless I'm talking about something historical or whatever to describe what was going on. I don't want to use it in my course, though, to talk about being proficient in a concept or reaching proficiency or a high level of competency. There are other ways I can say it. I just used a couple of those ways to say it. I don't have to use the word master or mastery. And I'm committing to stopping using that word. And that word in particular has taught me a big lesson. Because at first, when I first heard that problem with the term mastery, I thought, oh, really? Does that really bother people? Does it? Does that really bring up bad thoughts, negative thoughts when it comes up in the context of an explanation about a course or about the content of that course or about progress in that course? Does that really happen? But you know what? Just the very fact that I was educated about that started that happening in me. I still, when I hear that term, I cringe. I'm not cringing because of the harm done to me or my family over the years because of the institution of slavery and the cruelty of the masters of slaves. Instead, it's bringing up the idea of the fact that that happened. It's bringing up the fact of the idea that people do have those thoughts when they hear that term, because I'm having thoughts, not the same thoughts, but it's still being triggered in me, who is not a direct victim of the institution of slavery. I think we're all victims of slavery in one way or the other, some much more than others, of course. And I don't include myself in that category, but it has harmed my society. It harms the way I live in society. And I just don't want to be insensitive to my students. So I get triggered. My sensitivity part of my brain, when I hear that term, I cringe and think, oh no, don't use that word. That word creates harm for people. So if that's happening to me, the person probably least affected by the harmful side of using that kind of terminology, then I can't imagine how harmful, or at the very least, distracting to students and educators who have been more directly harmed by this. So I guess my point is that, I don't know, maybe we should all join together in helping each other identify some of these problematic terms and encourage one another, not shoot each other down like, oh, you said it, you said the bad word, but instead just encourage each other and inform one another in the use of kind words. And I don't think we're ever going to reach that ultimate goal of being the perfectly compassionate, perfectly kind, perfectly empathetic instructor. But by golly, every day, I'm going to commit to keep trying. A searchable transcript and a captioned audiogram of this episode are funded by AAA, the American Association for Anatomy. You know, throughout the year, AAA provides an incredible amount of support in the form of awards and grants to educators from early career to late career. And I think some of them even apply post-career. If you need support for your work or your professional development, or if you want to recognize a peer for their contributions, or just, check out what's going on, simply go to the American Association for Anatomy website at anatomy.org. If you've been listening to this podcast for any length of time, you know that I sometimes annoyingly often bring up this idea of storytelling as a basic strategy of teaching. And of course, what I mean by that is, we tell stories. We tell stories about, a certain discovery that, was made and how it was made, because that might somehow help inform or provide some background information for our students to understand that concept. But I also mean it in a much broader sense, in that it's up to us to take all of those concepts within anatomy and physiology and weave them together into a coherent framework or story. And that is, we're telling the story of the human body. And we may not use story conventions like, once upon a time, there lived a little brain that had, no. I mean, we can do that. Some people do that. I've done that within concepts from time to time, telling stories about these two ions and the way they interact with one another or something like that. But what I really mean is, are we laying out our concepts in a way that makes sense? And are we making sense of it? Are we telling the story in a way that makes sense to students? Or are we instead just saying, here's this part and what it does, here's this part and what it does, and here's this other part and what it does, and our test is on Tuesday? That's not storytelling. That's just spewing out information. And I don't mean just in lectures. Lectures certainly need to be a story of some kind. But I also mean in all of the other components of our course, such as, any active learning projects that we're doing, case studies, for example, things like that. Even just how the course is put together. We're going to start with this topic first because it lays the basis of whatever. And then we're going to cover this system, and we're covering this system next because whatever our rationale is. And as I've mentioned on many previous podcasts, the order of events in that story aren't really that critical as long as they make some sort of sense. So it's always amusing and interesting to me when I find other A&P faculty discussing whether this topic should come earlier than that topic and so on. And those are all useful and very intriguing conversations. I'd like to be part of those kind of discussions. But in the back of my mind, I also know that there are many ways to tell the same story. And what we need to find as storytellers is the way of telling a story that works for us. So that's just a long way of summarizing some of the main ideas that I've talked about before. But the reason I'm bringing it up now is just really a few days ago, there was some information that came out about the role of the hippocampus in our brain. Because we're now in this era of discovery in neuroscience where we're starting to see not just how individual memories are formed, we're starting to tease out how those memories are put together and connections are made. And not just at a very simplistic level, a little, neural network model level of, on switches and off switches and memories and so on. And all of that is essential basic work, and that's still ongoing too. But what I'm talking about is that kind of research that's really showing us how the brain takes all that stuff and makes sense of it and then pulls it out when we really need it. And so there was an article in Current Biology. It came out of the Center for Neuroscience at the University of California, Davis. And it shows that the hippocampus, it plays the role of storyteller in the brain. It's the one that recognizes, or it is that part or at least contains part of that mechanism that is going to identify the elements of a story and, more importantly, identify how those elements connect with one another to make it a story. So I was kind of excited to read this because it's just more evidence that my approach, and I don't mean mine like I invented it, but the approach I've adopted of storytelling is one that is useful, and it actually reflects the way the brain really works. And we're seeing that the hippocampus is a center of that process. It's a central agent of that process. For now, at least, we can call it the storyteller of the brain. And I guess by extension, what I can encourage myself and you to do is to think of ourselves as the hippocampus for our course. That it's our role to connect all of these different concepts in a coherent way, a way that makes sense. Because if we can do that, then the students are going to be much more likely to be able to apply all of that information later on. And that's what we're aiming for, right? We don't want them just learning separated facts. We want them to learn how to connect them. We want them to already be connected in the brains of our students so that when they run across one or the other again, they're going to know that they need to pull that information out. And also, here's all these other connected bits of information, and we can evaluate and see, well, how do they fit into the story? And so, in a way, we're training our students to build stories. It's this huge, complicated, epic story that we're building in their brain, just one little story or scene at a time. So yes, maybe I'm going to make a t-shirt that says that I want to be the hippocampus for my students, for my course. The free distribution of this podcast is sponsored by the Master of Science in Human Anatomy and Physiology instruction, the HAPI degree from Northeast College of Health Sciences. The MS HAPI credential reflects substantial training and experience in teaching A&P. It's something you want for yourself and something you'll look for in candidates wanting to join your department. Check out this online graduate program at northeastcollege.edu/HAPI. That's HAPI. Or click the link in the show notes or episode page. Way back in episode 63, I said that the leading cause of premature graying of hair in humans is teaching A&P. I think I did say that actually, but if I did, I meant it in a joking way as I do now because, well, I don't know. I mean, I guess it could be because, there is evidence, and that's what I was talking about is another bit of evidence that we discovered at that time in terms of how stress does affect how the stress of the fight or flight response really can turn hair white. And we know that mixing white hairs in with whatever our natural hair color is, for me, it's dark brown. Most people would say when I was younger that my hair was black. And I still do have a bunch of black or dark brown hairs, but not enough of them to overcome the white hairs. So most people think of me as being gray-haired, or depending on the angle, because it's a patchwork, it's in different areas, you might consider my hair to be completely white. But the point is that, yeah, stress is a factor. Stress, and we're working out, the mechanism of how that works, how hyperactivation of sympathetic nerves can drive the depletion of melanocyte stem cells. And so we're working out those mechanisms, and that's teaching us more about how the skin works and might lead to, how we evaluate or assess or stage or treat melanoma or, who knows, all kinds of things. You never know where a scientific discovery is going to lead us. So that was back in episode 63. Well, the reason I'm bringing it up now is that there's additional new research that shows that, at least for some people, and this crosses whether you're a typical male or typical female. It crosses over whether you're a younger adult or older adult. crosses over, any kind of ethnic background or anything like that. So it's a relatively small group, so there's a lot more research to go. But it was a somewhat varied group. It was mostly white individuals, but there was some variation in there. And they found that some people can reverse from gray back to their natural color. And when they start looking more closely at it, they did discover a link between stress and whether you can turn your hair, not like you're doing it intentionally, but whether your hair turns back to its natural color, or at least some of your hairs turn back to a natural color. And what I mean by that is they found, and it was pretty interesting research that they did. And I'm, as always, have a link in the show notes to that research so you can read through it. They found that with these people, they could track back in time because, with your hair, you can kind of figure out when different parts of the shaft of a hair may have been first formed in the hair follicle. So they did some mapping out time-wise and then, interviewed these people. And sure enough, a lot of the people that exhibited this characteristic or this event, when their hair started to turn back to its natural color, that started happening when they were on a 2-week vacation. I can guarantee you they didn't find it happening during in-service before the beginning of a new semester. I don't know if they asked that question, but I'm just guessing. This is my hypothesis. And so anyway, interesting thing about how the graying of hair works. And I do fairly regularly get questions from students when we start talking about gray hair and all that. Because, this is early in the A&P course, usually when I teach the skin and hair, nails, and all that stuff. And so students are, becoming more and more intrigued with that story of the human body. And so they're asking questions like that too. Does your hair really continue to grow after you die? Does stress really cause gray hair? Is it possible for gray hair to turn back into its natural color without, some artificial means? So if you ever get a question along those lines, you can say, yeah, that does happen in some people sometimes. And it has to do with reducing stress. So let's all stop for a moment and take a deep breath or two. Let's breathe in and breathe out slowly. And let's reduce our stress in A&P so that it's less likely to cause graying of hairs. Not that that's bad. I love having gray hairs. Marketing support for this podcast is provided by HAPS, the Human Anatomy and Physiology Society, promoting excellence in the teaching of human anatomy and physiology for over 30 years. I recently participated in the September virtual meeting, and I gotta say, it was awesome. Hey, there's another one coming up in November, and you certainly don't want to miss that one. To find out more, go visit HAPS at theapprofessor.org/HAPS. That's HAPS. Can you believe it? It's another segment about that darn wacky testing scheme that I have. Over the last several episodes, I think it started in episode 99, continued to episode 100, then to 101. Now we're on episode 102, and I'm still talking about it. Of course, you can believe it if you're a longtime listener, because that's kind of how I roll, right? But if you're a new listener, this might be like, is this all he ever talks about? And the answer is no. But lately, once I get on a roll and people start asking questions and there's some engagement going on and some debate going on, well, yeah, that's a time to capture that. And while we're all, have it fresh in our memories and we're all, have all these questions out there that we're aware of. So if this is your first episode listening, or even your second episode, it might not be a bad idea to roll back to episode 99 and listen to at least those parts of those segments in each episode that discuss this, and then come back to this segment and see what in the world it is I'm talking about. It'll make perfect sense if you don't do that. I'm just saying that's an option. So what happened here? So over the time span since I recorded the last episode, I gave a presentation at one of the virtual HAPS meetings, and it was called Connecting Concepts in Human Science, helping learners grow from familiarity to proficiency. And that subtitle actually is a good example of something else I talked about in this episode, and that is being sensitive about terminology. Because when I first wrote up my abstract and title and so on and put that in at HAPS, the subtitle was Helping Learners Grow from Mastery from, oh gosh, what did I say? I don't know. Helping learners grow from I can't even say it now. And as many times as I practice that presentation, I can't even say the full title of it. So the subtitle was Helping Learners Grow from Familiarity to Proficiency. The original one was Helping Learners Grow from Familiarity to Mastery. And in a previous segment in this episode, I talked about some of the problems with using the term mastery. So here's an example of me applying that principle. And only recently, I didn't think about it bothering anybody before. And now I fixed that. And so hopefully other things about the presentation probably bothered people, but not that, and not in that way, I hope. But even so, as I was going through, I had 9 strategies for helping students connect concepts in their head, like the hippocampus does, right? So I was going through those, and every once in a while I'd say, now, here's something I talk about a lot on my podcast. And then I would mention whatever strategy it was. And so one of the listeners, Gilbert Pitts, he came back to me with some questions because he said, that got me thinking about this. And so I went back and listened to the last few episodes that you talked about this wacky scheme of testing. That wasn't his words. Those are my words. And specifically, he was asking me a very good question that I've not addressed yet and has not been asked of me yet, at least not in this thread of conversation that we've been having recently. And that is, what kind of numbers do you have on that? I mean, how do you know that the students are doing better? Because I've mentioned that a few times. I've said the students are doing better now, so that's why I believe it works. That's why I believe in it. That's why I'm talking about it and sharing these ideas, because I think they're good. I think they work. But, we're scientists and we want to measure things and we want to see, is that, you have a lot of bias there, I detect. And I'm just saying this to myself. I know I have bias because it worked. But how do I know it worked? Well, okay, here's the story. I started doing this over 20 years ago. And even now, not just back then, but even now, I am not a researcher. I did do research way, way long ago with bird physiology, and that I never really did any serious scholarship of teaching and learning, cognitive science scholarship. That's something that has only recently blossomed, historically speaking, only recently blossomed within teaching A&P. And so, that's just never been one of the hats I wear. I have too many hats as it is. I wish I had time to do that. It is very intriguing to me, but I didn't. But I did look at numbers. I think we should all look at numbers in our courses and so on. What is the trend of grades, for example? What's the trend of test scores? If we're not watching that, then, how do we know whether anything's working? How do we know when problems exist? And, more and more of the learning management systems are giving us some very rich tools that we're usually too busy to take the time to learn. But, anytime you have some time to learn that, or any opportunity to attend a workshop or whatever for how to dive in the stats in your learning management system and how to make sense of them and what strategies to use when you find a problem and, even just diagnosing what the problem is. I would encourage us all to do that. But I'm just saying that really wasn't available to me back then, at least not at the level it was. And back then I was just learning how to use learning management systems, period. So I was lucky to get my course out the door, or online, I should say, because, it's just where I was. But I was really intrigued by this, and I was invited to speak at a conference back in in 2002. It was the 16th International Conference of the IFAA. That's the International Federation of Associations of Anatomy. And that happened to be in Kyoto, Japan in 2002. And I was invited to speak within a section that was all about teaching co-medical anatomy. And what they mean by co-medical anatomy, apparently this is a pretty common term in Japan, probably in the Japanese language, not English, but translated. Co-medical anatomy is referring to things that are not medical school anatomy, which is exactly what I do. I have taught medical students, but what I'm mostly teaching are undergraduates. These are students who are going into things that are not medical doctors, but they're going to be nurses, or they're going to be physical therapists or occupational therapists, or they're going to be health information professionals, or, just there's a whole basket full of different kinds of health careers and so on. So we would probably say allied health anatomy or something like that. I don't know. But anyway, so that was the section I was invited in. And in talking back and forth with them, I proposed the idea of talking about something that was relatively new to me back then, and that was this scheme of online testing and using formative testing as a way of teaching, a way of learning for my students that was a departure from the way I had been doing it and the way most of us do it and had been doing it even then. So I did that, and I presented some data, but I can't say it was very thoroughly tested statistically. So, I have to throw that caveat out that I could have done much better. I wish I'd done much better looking back on it now, but I didn't. So this is what I have, and I still have a lot of the data. So someday when I get extra time to do stuff that's on my list, and I have a growing list, then maybe I'll go back and do some of that. Or if one of you wants to take that information or maybe several of you want to take that information and go back and, muddle your way through it and see if there's something you can get out of it. Or maybe you want to retest my hypothesis in your own scenario. That would be great. But anyway, if you want to, it was published in the Anatomical Science International, number 79 on page 188. And this is all in the show notes and episode page. You don't need to write it down if you really do want to go and look at it. And it was a special edition. It was a supplemental edition that I've never really been able to find anywhere else. I mean, I have a copy of it, but I think it was just people who attended who were later sent a copy of it. I don't know. It was, proceedings of this International Congress of Associations of Anatomy. And the only thing that was published was the abstract. It really didn't give any of this data. But, I do have the abstract. I have a place that where you can go and read the abstract online. And that's linked in the show notes and episode page. And I also have a link to a seminar that I did, that very seminar that I presented back then, except I re-recorded it a few years ago to update it, to add some things at the end. Said, since that time, I've done this and this and this. But the statistics part of it is still the same. So you can go back and either listen to the seminar or just look at the handout, because every slide is printed in the handout at a large enough size that you can actually read each slide and read the numbers on it. And so you can see what these numbers are. So don't worry about getting the numbers down. And I'm really going to speak to that just in generalities anyway. So you can go back and look at any of that stuff. And there's been plenty of research to show that any of the things I do in terms of this wacky scheme of testing, there's all kinds of research out there in cognitive science that support the idea of it. They're just not testing my students to see how it was working in my course. So what I want to talk about now is my statistics, even, is unanalyzed or underanalyzed, I should say, as they are. So in my presentation, I looked at the course average, the numbers, I looked at the final exam scores, and then I looked at the number of students, because I think it's important in science experiments that you want to get a large number of students if you can, because then that's going to give you more reliable information, I think. So I was comparing the old way of doing things, that is giving paper tests and paper exams, traditional way, in class, And so I labeled those the old way group. It really would be the control group. And then I had two separate groups of students who had taken A&P 1 using what I called the new way. That would be the experimental group. And so I had 2 and 2. In the control group, the old way group, those two groups, one of them had 159 students, another one had 197 students. So about 250 students, I guess. No, 350 students. So that's a pretty big number, I think. And then in the experimental group, the new way group, and remember, there were 2 subgroups of each. So in one subgroup, I had 210 students, and the other one I had 209. So that's about 420 students. So I had a pretty large group in both, and they were similar size groups, not exactly the same, but similar size groups. And then when I looked at the course average, using my old system, the classic system of testing, in those 2 subgroups, the course average was 70 in one group and 74 in another group. And that's somewhat of a gap that maybe bears looking into to see, well, why did one group do so much better than the other group? Now, that second group was taught a year later than the first group. And I'm always tweaking my course. So maybe one or more of the tweaks that I did had something to do with that gap. I also like to believe, and this may or may not be true, but in my world, it's true, is that I get better as I go on because I really work at it. And I really think I'm getting to be a better teacher the more I teach. And so maybe I just did a better job that year. And I mean, it could have been characteristics of that cohort of students. I don't know. But that's what I had, 70 and 74. So now how did that compare to the 2 groups that I looked at once I started doing this online testing? And to clarify from previous episodes, this was A&P 1, so I had 9 online tests and 2 traditional exams, a midterm exam and a final exam. Those were face-to-face setting, paper exams. They were not open book. They could bring a little card. I think I was doing that at that time. I'll have to go back through my notes and see. But they could bring a little card that had, things written down on it. But as I've mentioned before, the students who bothered to make a card, and some of them didn't, they ended up not ever using them because the process of making the card helped them review the stuff enough. And I think all those online tests they did helped them review. They were pretty much prepared. They didn't really have to do a lot of cramming to do well on the exam. And so you're saying, just spit it out. What were the results? So remember, the old result, the old way. See, I'm building tension here, building anticipation. The old way, remember this. Oh, wait a minute. I didn't even tell you the old way. Okay. So the old way, when I did the final exam, the average score was 46 in one subgroup and 51 in the other subgroup. Not too great, right? And luckily, those students had other grades that they could use to bring up their test grade, a situation I'm going to talk a lot more about in the next episode because I don't think that's necessarily ideal for us to be doing that. But that's the way I did it. I think that's the way a lot of us do that, is just average everything together. And yeah, you do some bad on some things, you do really good on other things, and all averages out, and hopefully you pass. Maybe pass with that B that you need to get into your program. So anyway, so 46 and 51, that was what I was seeing in those previous groups of students. What about once I switched to the new way? When I got to the final exam, and I remember this was still the same kind of exam. It was still the traditional paper test. It's not open book. And so what was the scores? It wasn't 46 and 51 like I saw before. It was 67 and 67. They were both, the averages were the same for that. So that's a pretty big jump. It's between, 15, 20 or more points in the score. And so, yeah, I didn't do any statistical tests on it, but I'm not sure I have to, do I? I don't know, maybe I do. You tell me. But to me, that satisfied me to assure me that I was on the right track, that this really was working. And of course, year by year after that, I would check on that to make sure there was no big dip back to where it had been for a while before I start doing this scheme. And of course, every time I add it, that's just, again, the way I do things, then I started doing cumulative testing, and then I started doing pre-testing. And I think each one of those, and for similar reasons, because I looked at the grades and it seemed to help. And I talked to students. And speaking of talking to students, I have some stats on that too that was presented in Kyoto way back in 2002. And I'm just trying to find it in my notes here. I'm actually on that page and scrolling through those stat slides here. Okay, so let me get to these graphs here. So I surveyed the students each of those years, and I would often give students a survey of various things in the course, because the surveys that my college gives, they're pretty much useless to me. They don't really answer the kinds of questions I want an answer to. I don't want to know if they think I'm competent in my subject. They're not in a position to judge how competent I am in my subject, or even how organized I am. I mean, I can copy somebody's nice syllabus and they think I'm organized, and maybe I'm not, so none of that stuff matters to me. I have my own questions. So of course, during these times, I asked the students that had been doing it this new way, do these online tests make you better prepared for the exams? Now, remember, back in 2002, students were not taking a lot, if any, online exams in other courses, either while they were taking A&P or before they took A&P. It was a relatively new phenomenon to them. And so I asked them, do online tests make you better prepared for the exams? Now, of course, that's subjective. Now, some students are going to think of it objectively, and their answer is probably going to be more reliable and more useful, but I'm going to have to count on the fact that nobody's doing that this is just their gut feeling. Is their gut feeling that they're better prepared? And so out of 171 students that I asked that question, 170 of them felt better prepared. One student didn't feel that they were better prepared. And of course, it was probably, and I'm being biased here, I know, and I'm being bad, but it's that one student who walked into the course absolutely certain that they knew more than me or anyone else about A&P, right? So no, the online test didn't help them because they already know everything. So then I asked them, do the online tests help you learn the concepts of the course better? Out of that same group of students, 155 of them said yes, that online tests do help them learn the concepts of the course better. And 16 students said that the online test did not help them learn the concepts of the course better, which makes me wonder why sounds a little bit like they're saying something different than they did in the previous question, but these are the results I got. I didn't fudge anything. So a little over 90% said, yep, it helped them learn the concepts of the course. And almost 10% said, no, not so much. Another question I asked them, because I suspected this might be true, even though it was only, we divide our course into lab sections and lecture sections, and they're taught separately, sometimes by different instructors. And so the question here is, do online tests help you prepare for the practical exams in lab? So I'm asking, do these lecture tests I'm giving you, do they make you do better, or do they help you do better in your lab course? Which at that time at least was based almost entirely, the lab grade almost entirely, on their practical exams. And so what was the result? Well, 89.5% of them said, yes, it does help them in lab. About 10% said no. It's almost the same breakdown as we saw in the previous question. 153 said yes, 18 students said no. And it could, I don't know, I mean, I'm just making stuff up here, but it could be that some of those students who said no just weren't clearly seeing the connection between what we were doing in lecture and what we were doing in lab, or just in their minds it was so compartmentalized that they just felt like that was the best answer for them. And of course, when you're doing a survey, especially a student at the end of the semester, they're not going to really take time and be 100% into it the way we'd like them to be, right? Then I asked a bunch of other questions like what resources do you use while taking the test? 164 of them said that they use the textbook when they're taking the online test. 7 said no, they don't. I provide skeleton outlines for my students where it's just sort of it's the skeleton of what we do. And then many of the students actually take notes as they're studying or as they're in a lecture or doing other activities. They take notes on that and fill it in. But I do the skeleton outline so that it builds kind of a conceptual framework. They know sort of the order of the story that I'm telling. And so did they use their outlines? 170 of them said yes, and only 1 said no. And do they use additional notes that they've taken? Because some students take notes besides on the outline. Some of them don't even do it on the outline. So 142 said, yep, they did that. 28 said, no, they don't. And then I asked, what about the previous attempts? Did you look at copies of the previous attempts that you took as you took an online test? And 155 of them said yes, and only 16 said no. Well, I hope that most of them do, because they can go back and say, well, I had a question sort of like this on a previous attempt. What did I answer for that? And was it right or wrong? So yeah, they're going to go back, not for every question and compare, because that just takes too long. And we know students are going to say, oh, I want to take as much time as I can to get this required activity done. No, they're going to try and take shortcuts, right? So they're going to go back and look at those previous attempts only when they have to. And when they do, they're almost certainly not going to see the same question, but they might see a question that's similar, or they're certainly going to see a question that's asking about the same group of concepts or subgroup of concepts and so on. Another question I asked that was, I thought had some interesting results is, do online tests have a high level of difficulty? Because something I heard from students that were coming into my course and also from colleagues overheard in the hallway is that, oh my gosh, he gives open online tests. That's too easy. You're just letting them fly by. Where's the rigor? And of course, that's not what the students were saying. That's what other faculty were at least implying. And what the students were saying when they came in is, yeah, I heard this test is easy. You have mostly online tests and they're open book. So, but I mean, that's right. Typical student perspective, right? That's all they see is like, oh, it's open book. I can just look up the answers. But then once they get the test, they see, well, where would I find that answer? That's not in the book. I mean, the information needed to answer, it's in the book, but I have to put it together. This is a mystery. This is a puzzle. This is something like on Dateline. I have to find the evidence and think it through and what's most logical and how do I apply it here? And so when I asked them, do online tests have a high level of difficulty? 62%. So over half, not quite 2/3, said yes, they have a high level of difficulty. About 38% said no, they didn't have a high level of difficulty. I don't know. I guess that's not too unexpected. I thought it would be a little more skewed, that more of them would have labeled them as difficult. But remember, this is at the end of the semester where they've really gotten the hang of these online tests. So maybe they kind of knew how to do it. They knew they'd built up some skills. And yeah, no, it's not hard now. It's like asking someone at the end of 4 years of studying French, is French hard to learn? It's easy. Well, yeah, if you're at the end of your 4 years of learning how to speak French, I guess you would say that, wouldn't you? And maybe not, but you'd be more likely to say that. So I don't know, that could have something to do with it. But again, that's probably my biases bubbling up, saying, well, why did so many of them say it wasn't very difficult when so many said it was? So, almost 2/3 of them said it was. So, I mean, there's some numbers that kind of counter my natural inclination when I first started thinking about doing this sort of thing is, wouldn't that be too easy? I mean, how is that going to help anybody for anything? By just, throwing it all out there and letting them look up the answers. That's not going to do any good. But they were challenged by it, significantly challenged by these online tests. So those are some of the stats. And like I say, you can kind of go through that in maybe a little more coherent way if you go to that seminar. And in order to do that, you can use this URL. Just go to the approfessor.org/ Testing is Teaching. All one word, all lowercase. theapprofessor.org/testing is teaching. But you know that I have links always in the show notes at the episode page for any of these segments if you want to learn more about it. Gilbert already knows those answers because I got back to him, but I really appreciate Gilbert Pitts coming to me with those questions because I think it's one that needs to be answered, and that's the answer I have. It helps all of us when you share episodes that intrigue you, or enlighten you, or, I don't know, make you mad as heck. Sharing episodes is easy to do. Just go to the approfessor.org/refer to get a personalized share link that will not only get your friend all set up with this episode, it'll also get you on your way to earning a cash reward. If you don't see links in your podcast player, go to the show notes at the episode page at the approfessor.org. And while you're there, you can claim your digital credential for listening to this episode. And you're always encouraged to call in with your questions and comments and ideas at the podcast hotline. That's 1-833-LION-DEN or 1-833-546-6336. Or send a recording or written message to podcast@theapprofessor.org. I'll see you down the road.
The A&P Professor is hosted by Dr. Kevin Patton, an award-winning professor and textbook author in human anatomy and physiology.
Please do not feed the animals. They are fed a natural, healthy diet that does not include your French fries.